The stagecoach came around the bend at Willow Rock too fast, and Lavinia Turner knew before the shots even sounded that something was wrong. She had been riding the ridge trail above the Carrizo Road since dawn, taking the long way into Esperanza because the low road had turned to soup after 3 days of rain, and from that height she saw the whole thing unfold like a nightmare played out on a stage far below her. 4 riders broke from the rocks on both sides of the road. The driver hauled on the brake and the horses screamed, and the coach skidded sideways on the slick clay, its wheels catching a rut, and then it went over with a crash that she felt in her chest a full 3 seconds before the sound reached her ears. She did not think. She put her heels into her mare and sent her down the slope at an angle no sane rider would choose, because there was no time to be sane. Clarence McCrae heard the same shots from half a mile east, where he had been easing 11 head of cattle along the fence line for the Rourke outfit, trying to keep them off the worst of the mud. He left the cattle to scatter where they pleased. A man could always gather cattle. He could not always gather the dead. He came onto the road from the brush with his rifle already up, and the first thing he saw was a woman on a gray mare riding straight at armed men, as if she meant to run them down with nothing but will. "Get down," he shouted, though he doubted she would listen, and he was right, because she did not even turn her head. The bandits had not expected resistance from 2 directions at once. One of them fired at Lavinia and missed as her mare shied, and Clarence put a bullet in the dirt at the man's feet close enough to change his mind about a second shot. The others scattered toward the rocks, more interested now in survival than in whatever strongbox had brought them out into the rain in the first place, and within a handful of frantic, deafening seconds, they were gone up the wash, leaving the overturned coach groaning on its side in the mud. Lavinia was down from her horse before it had fully stopped moving. She could hear crying from inside the coach, a child's voice, thin and terrified, and a man's voice grinding out curses through pain. "Careful of the door," she called to Clarence as he came running up. "It is on the underside now. We cannot open it without dropping whoever is against it straight down onto the road." He looked at her for the length of one breath, surprised that she had already worked that out, and then he was moving, because there was no time to be surprised about anything. "The window, then," he said. "Up top." Together they climbed onto the belly of the overturned coach, boots slipping on wet wood, and Clarence broke the glass out of the high window with the butt of his rifle while Lavinia reached her arm down inside to steady a small girl who was wedged against a fallen trunk. "I have got her," Lavinia said. "Take her when I lift." She was strong in a way that surprised him, hauling the child up through the narrow frame with her own boots braced against the coach's side, and Clarence took the girl into his arms and set her down on the road with more gentleness than his big scarred hands looked capable of. Inside, the driver was pinned beneath the weight of an overturned trunk and a man's leg, and there was a great deal of noise from a heavy-set gentleman who kept insisting that his hat had been a genuine beaver felt from a shop in Sacramento and was now ruined. "Your hat is the least of your troubles," Lavinia told him through the window, not unkindly, but with no patience for foolishness either, and set to work helping guide the trunk up and out so Clarence could haul it free. It took the better part of 20 minutes, working in the mud with the rain starting again in earnest, before all 4 passengers were free of the wreck. The driver had a broken wrist and a face gone gray with shock. The heavy-set gentleman turned out to be a mining supply salesman with more opinions than sense. The child belonged to a thin, exhausted woman who could not stop weeping her thanks. And the 4th passenger, once he had been extracted with considerable groaning, introduced himself as Judge Adelbert Finch, riding the circuit out of Carson City, and he looked at the 2 of them, mud-soaked and bleeding from small cuts, with an expression of frank astonishment. "I have seen a great many things on this road," the judge said, holding his injured arm against his ribs, "but I have never seen a ranch woman and a drifting cowhand take on 4 armed men together as though it were something they did every Tuesday. "We did not plan it together," Lavinia said. "We simply happened to be in the same disaster." Clarence allowed himself the smallest of smiles at that, though he did not let her see much of it. He was already looking up the wash where the bandits had gone, memorizing the shape of the land, the direction, the fact that one horse had thrown a shoe judging by the tracks. "Those were not road agents looking for a lucky purse," he said. "They knew this coach was coming. They knew when." Lavinia followed his gaze up the wash, and something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through her coat. "There is only one road in or out of this district," she said quietly, "and only one man in Esperanza who profits from knowing exactly who travels it, and when, and what they carry." Clarence looked at her sideways, unwilling yet to trust a stranger's certainty, but there was something in the flat, tired way she said it that told him this was not the first grievance she had laid at that particular door. "You are talking about Silas Voss," he said. "I am talking about Silas Voss," she agreed, and then she turned away to see to the frightened child, because there was work yet to be done, and she had never in her life let anger get in front of duty. They got the passengers onto the backs of their 2 horses and Clarence's borrowed mule for the walk into Esperanza, moving slow through the mud with the rain coming down harder by the mile, and it was full dark by the time they reached the town's single street, lit by a scattering of lanterns hung out under the eaves of the mill company store. Esperanza was not much of a town in the way that towns back east were towns. It existed because the Carrizo stamp mill existed, because silver ore came down from the Rourke and Hargrove and Turner range country to be crushed and processed, because one narrow road connected the mill to the wagon route north, and because water was scarce enough in most seasons that whoever controlled the ditch rights controlled everything else besides. Silas Voss owned the mill. Silas Voss held the paper on half the ranches in the district, including, Lavinia thought bitterly as they rode in, her own. It was Voss himself who came out onto the store porch when word spread of the wrecked coach, a neat, unhurried man in a good coat that had never once been rained on, and his face arranged itself into exactly the right amount of concern. "Judge Finch," he said, "thank the Lord you are alive. This road has become a disgrace. I have said for a year that the county ought to see to it properly." "The county did not hold up my coach, Mr. Voss," the judge said dryly, cradling his wrist. "Men did that, and they knew my schedule better than I did myself." Something flickered behind Voss's eyes, gone as quick as it came, and he was all smooth sympathy again in the next breath, offering rooms and a doctor and hot coffee, and Lavinia watched him do it with the particular weariness of a woman who had watched him do it before, over other misfortunes in other seasons. She caught Clarence's eye across the lantern light, and for just a moment they shared something unspoken, a recognition that they had both, without a single word passing between them beforehand, arrived at the very same suspicion. "Thank you for the help back there," she said to him finally, because manners cost nothing and she had been raised right, whatever else people like to say about her pride these days. "Wasn't help," Clarence said, "was just 2 people doing what needed doing. That is a fine way to avoid a simple thank you. Ma'am, I have been avoiding simple things my whole life. It is something of a specialty." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Lavinia Turner," she said, because it seemed foolish to keep standing there as strangers after what they had just done together. "Clarence McCrae," he answered, and touched the brim of his hat, and neither one of them yet had any idea how much that muddy, blood and rain-soaked road would come to matter between them before the summer was through. The days after the ambush passed in the particular business of a mining district trying to put itself back together after a scare. The sheriff, a heavy-set, tired man named Boone Callahan, rode out to Willow Rock and found little beyond hoofprints already softened by rain, and privately admitted to Judge Finch that 4 masked riders on a public road were, in his considered opinion, a great deal easier to arrange than to catch. Voss made a public show of offering a reward for information, which impressed the salesman from Sacramento a great deal, and impressed almost no one else at all. Clarence took work with the Rourke outfit driving a mixed herd north toward the rail siding at Wells, the kind of drive that other men turned down because the grass along that stretch had gone thin 2 years running, and the water holes were unreliable even without a month of storms working against a man. Old Tom Rourke had learned, over a decade of hiring drovers, that Clarence McCrae was the man you sent when a job could not afford to fail. And Clarence had learned, over that same decade, that being trusted with the hardest work suited a man who had nowhere in particular he needed to be, and no one waiting on him to come home. He thought, more than once on that drive, about the woman on the gray mare who had ridden straight at armed men without so much as flinching. He told himself it did not matter, since the Turner Range lay well south of anywhere his work was likely to take him again, and a drifting cowhand had no business thinking twice about a ranch woman with land and debts and a name of her own to protect. He was wrong about that, as it happened, within the month. Lavinia's trouble had a longer history than one washed-out road. Her father, Wendell Turner, had built the ranch up from nothing across 20 hard years, and when the silver strike came to Carrizo, he had done what half the ranchers in the district did and borrowed against next year's herd to expand his range and improve his water, because Silas Voss's bank offered easy terms to men who supplied beef to a hungry mill town. Wendell had died 2 winters past, of a fever that took him fast and left his daughter a ranch, a debt, and a very great deal of pride about handling both without anybody's charity. The debt itself was manageable if the cattle came through and the summer grass held. What was not manageable, what had begun to feel deliberate in a way Lavinia could not yet prove, was the sudden run of bad luck that had settled over her range since spring. Fence wire cut in 3 places, a watering trough fouled, 20 head of stock found wandering onto Hargrove land, with Hargrove's foreman swearing up and down that Turner cattle had trespassed and eaten grass that belonged to another man's herd. The Hargrove ranch sat to the west of hers, a smaller spread run by a proud, quick-tempered widower named Ezra Hargrove, who had never much liked Wendell Turner and liked his daughter less, mostly because she had once told him plainly, at a county gathering, that his fences were a disgrace and his temper worse. It was an old grudge, small as these things went, but it was exactly the kind of small grudge that grew teeth when someone patient and unseen kept feeding it. "You will not go over there and shout at Ezra Hargrove," said her foreman, an old, weathered man named Amos Krebs who had worked the Turner Range since before Lavinia was born, watching her saddle her horse with the particular grimness that meant she intended to do exactly that. "I am not going to shout," Lavinia said. "I am going to ask him calmly why his men are telling everyone in Esperanza that Turner cattle ruined his hay meadow when I know for a fact my herd was penned that whole week. Calm has never once been the word for it when you two are in the same room. Then it will be a first for both of us." It was not a first, as it turned out. Ezra Hargrove met her at his gate with his rifle across his arm, not aimed exactly, but not put away either, and told her in language that grew steadily less polite that he did not appreciate being accused of lying about his own hay meadow, and that if Turner cattle kept finding their way onto his land, he would start shooting first and counting brands after. "Nobody has accused you of lying, Ezra," Lavinia said, holding her temper with an effort that cost her more than she would ever admit. "I am asking you to consider that neither of us is doing this to the other. Somebody is cutting my fences at night. Somebody drove those cattle onto your land deliberately. Have you thought even once about who benefits from the two of us hating each other?" "I have thought about it plenty," Ezra said, "and I keep landing on you, since it is your fence and your cattle that keep ending up on my side of the line." There was no reasoning with him that day, and Lavinia rode home with her jaw set and her pride bruised, having asked, in her own roundabout way, for exactly the kind of neighborly help she would have died before begging for outright, and been refused it flat. She did not go to the sheriff about the fences, either, though Amos urged her to twice. Sheriff Callahan had a great deal of respect for Voss's mill, and not much time to spare chasing down cut wire on a ranch belonging to a woman who managed perfectly well, in his stated opinion, on her own. Lavinia had heard variations of that sentence her whole adult life, and she had learned that asking for help from men who believed that about her rarely bought her anything but their satisfaction at being proven right when the help did not come through. So she mended the fences herself, twice in the rain, with Amos and one other hired man, a quiet young fellow named Dooley who had been with her only since spring. And when Dooley took a fever in the first week of July and had to be sent to his sister's place in Austin to recover, and Amos's knees gave him more trouble than he would admit in wet weather, Lavinia found herself, for all practical purposes, running 400 head of cattle and 11 miles of fence line alone, in a summer that would not stop raining. The Carrizo district had never seen a July like it. Old-timers who had lived through droughts that killed whole herds now shook their heads over a summer where the wagon road turned to axle-deep mud, where the ditch that watered 3 ranches ran high and brown and dangerous, and where the low crossing at Antelope Creek washed out twice in a single week, cutting Esperanza off from the ranch country to the south for days at a stretch. It was on one such cut-off evening, with the rain drumming steady on her roof and her supply of flour and coffee both worryingly low, that Lavinia came out onto her porch at first light and found a sack of provisions sitting neatly against her door. Flour, a tin of coffee, a slab of bacon wrapped in oilcloth against the wet, a coil of good new fence wire, exactly the gauge she used. No note, no sign of who had left it, save a single set of boot prints in the mud leading away from her step toward the road, prints too large to belong to any man she employed. She stood there a long moment with the sack in her arms, feeling something complicated move through her chest, something that was gratitude and outrage in roughly equal measure. "Amos," she called, when the old man came shuffling out to see what had made her stand so still. "Did you see anyone riding last night?" "Not a soul," Amos said, and then he looked at the sack and at the boot prints, and something like a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth that he wisely did not let bloom into a full one. "Somebody being neighborly, looks like. Somebody has no business being neighborly on my land without so much as a knock," Lavinia said, and carried the sack inside anyway, because it would have been a great deal more foolish to leave good flour out in the rain to prove a point about pride. It happened again 4 days later, and again the week after that, a mended hinge for her barn door replacing one that had rusted through, done so cleanly and quietly in the night that she never once heard a horse. She had a fair guess who it was, even before Amos, grinning now without any attempt to hide it, told her he had seen a big bay gelding tied at the tree line the last time, and a rider built like a fence post who had touched his hat brim to the old man before disappearing back the way he came. She found Clarence McCrae 3 weeks later at the Mercantile in Esperanza, buying rope, and she marched up to him with the particular controlled fury of a woman who has been rehearsing a speech in her head for several days. "Mr. McCrae." He turned and had the nerve, she thought, to look almost pleased to see her. "Miss Turner, I know it is you," she said without preamble. "Leaving things on my step like I am some charity case that cannot manage her own ranch." "Didn't say you couldn't manage it," he said, mild as milk. "Said nothing at all, in fact, since I never left a note. That is not the point." "What is the point, then?" She opened her mouth to tell him, and found, to her considerable annoyance, that the point was harder to say out loud than it had been in her head, where it had sounded a great deal more reasonable. "The point is that I did not ask you for help," she said finally. "And I will not have people in this town whispering that Lavinia Turner cannot keep her own larder full without a stranger's charity." "Wasn't charity," Clarence said, and something in his voice had gone quieter, more careful, though his eyes did not leave hers. "I drove cattle past your range a dozen times this month for the work outfit, and I have seen with my own eyes how thin your hands are stretched. Sending a man on ahead with fence wire is not charity, Miss Turner. It is just being decent to a neighbor whose fence I happen to be riding past anyway. I am not your neighbor. I do not even know where you sleep most nights." "No," he agreed, "you do not. But you know I helped you pull 4 strangers out of a wrecked coach in the mud without asking whether it was proper first. And I reckon leaving flour on a porch is a fair sight less trouble than that was." She stood there, rope in one hand, her carefully rehearsed anger draining out of her rather faster than she liked, because there was something maddeningly reasonable in the way he said it, and something in his face, weathered and honest and entirely unashamed, that made it very difficult to keep being furious at him. "Stop doing it," she said at last, though with considerably less heat than she had walked in with. "I will think about it," Clarence said, which was not a promise, and they both knew it, and she left the mercantile telling herself she was still angry, though she was not entirely sure by the time she reached her horse that this was true. The rope he had bought, she noticed later, was the exact same gauge as the wire he had left at her door. He did not stop, of course. That was the thing about Clarence McCrae that she would come to understand slowly, over the weeks that followed, turning it over the way a person turns over a stone that keeps surprising them with what lives beneath it. He was not a man given to grand gestures or loud declarations, but he was, once he had decided a thing was right, entirely immovable about doing it. Their paths crossed with a frequency that felt less like coincidence than like the shape of the district itself, which was small enough in the end that everyone's business eventually touched everyone else's. The Rourke outfit's cattle grazed range that bordered both Turner and Hargrove land. The one passable road, when it was passable at all, ran within sight of Lavinia's front gate, and Clarence, driving small bunches of cattle back and forth through that long, difficult July, found himself with more reasons than strictly necessary to pass by her ranch on his way to somewhere else. The 3rd week of the rains, he arrived at her gate in the middle of the afternoon leading a limping horse and looking like a man who had been rained on for roughly a decade. "I am not asking for help," he said, before she had even opened her mouth, which surprised a short laugh out of her despite herself. "I did not say a word. You had the look. What look is that?" "The one that says you are about to tell me to keep moving because you did not invite me. I was, in fact, about to ask what happened to your horse." He glanced down at the gelding, who was favoring its off foreleg badly, mud-caked halfway up its belly, pulled up lame in the wash crossing at Antelope Creek. "I was hoping you might have a shed dry enough to keep him out of the worst of it tonight, and I will be on my way in the morning." It was, she thought, a small and reasonable request, the kind any decent rancher extended to any decent traveler in weather like this, and yet she found herself hesitating, because letting Clarence McCrae onto her land felt like something larger than a shed and a lame horse, though she could not in that moment have said exactly why. "The shed by the North Corral is dry enough," she said. "You will have to muck it out first. I have not kept stock in there since spring." "Fair trade for a roof," he said, and led the horse through her gate without further argument, and that was, in its quiet way, the true beginning of it. She fed him that night because it would have been unconscionable not to, and he ate at her kitchen table with the particular careful manners of a man who had spent a great deal of his life eating alone and had not entirely lost the habit of being grateful for company, however guarded. "You are not from Nevada," she said, watching him across the table, curious despite her better judgment. "Missouri first, then Texas for a while. My family had a farm outside Jefferson City until the bank took it in the panic of '73. I was 17, went to Texas after that, worked cattle because it was the only work a boy with no land and no schooling could get that paid a wage." "You have been drifting since." 14 years, he said without self-pity, as though reciting a fact about weather. "I go where the work is hardest mostly, because outfits pay better for a man who will take on a drive nobody else wants, and because I have found over the years that a man with nowhere waiting on him does not much mind hard roads." "That sounds lonely," Lavinia said, before she could stop herself. "It is," he admitted, and looked at her steadily, "though I have not minded it much until lately." She looked down at her plate rather than answer that, because she understood exactly what he meant and was not yet ready to say so. "My father built this place from nothing," she said instead, turning the conversation somewhere safer, though not by much. 20 years of work. When the silver strike came and Voss's mill went up, he borrowed against next year's calves to expand our water rights, because everyone was doing it, because it seemed like the whole district was about to get rich together. Then he died 2 winters back and left me the ranch and the debt both, and every man in this valley who thinks a woman cannot run 400 head of cattle by herself has been waiting, very patiently, for me to prove them right. "I do not think that," Clarence said. "I know you do not," she said. That is rather the trouble. He did not press her on what she meant by that, though something in his expression told her he understood it well enough, and they sat a while longer in a silence that had, for the first time since she had met him, nothing uncomfortable in it at all. His horse mended over 3 days, days in which the rain slackened just enough to let them ride the fence line together, mending wire, and Lavinia found herself laughing, actually laughing, at his dry commentary on Ezra Hargrove's temper, on the mining supply salesman's ruined hat, on his own hopeless attempts at cooking anything more complex than bacon and coffee. "You survived 14 years on bacon and coffee. And whatever a chuck wagon cook took pity on me for, I'm not proud, Miss Turner. I will eat other men's biscuits without shame. That is not survival. That is charm dressed up as survival. Is it working?" "I have not decided yet," she said, though the smile she was fighting rather gave the answer away, and he saw it and did not push further, because he had learned already that pushing Lavinia Turner too hard on anything only made her dig her heels in twice as deep. It was during those mending days that they found the first hard evidence that something larger than an old grudge was at work in the valley. A section of fence near the boundary with Hargrove land had been cut, not with the ragged carelessness of a rushed job, but cleanly, deliberately, and refastened loosely enough to look, at a careless glance, like it had simply failed on its own. "That is no accident," Clarence said, crouching to examine the wire. "Somebody wanted this to look like poor upkeep on your part, wanted Hargrove to find his hay meadow chewed up and blame you, and never think to look at the wire itself. Somebody who knows exactly how fence fails naturally and how it fails on purpose," Lavinia said slowly. "Somebody who has spent time around cattle and range work." "Or somebody paying men who have," Clarence said, and they looked at each other with the same name rising, unspoken, between them. The proof, when it finally came almost by accident, the way real proof so often does, arriving sideways instead of through the door a person expects. Clarence had taken a short contract hauling ore sacks down to the Carrizo mill for a week when one of the Rourke outfit's regular haulers fell ill. And it was there, waiting his turn at the mill's loading dock in the rain, that he overheard 2 of Voss's clerks arguing in low voices about a ledger that had gone missing from the office, and about how Mr. Voss would have their hides if the Hargrove note and the Turner note ever got compared side by anyone with the sense to notice the dates matched. He said nothing, only listened, and that evening he rode to Lavinia's ranch faster than the mud strictly allowed. "The dates match," he told her, standing dripping in her kitchen doorway. "Voss extended new terms on your father's loan and on Ezra Hargrove's loan within the same week, 2 years back, right after he broke ground on the mill expansion. If I am reading this right, he needs more water than the district has got, and the easiest way to get it is to own the water rights on both your ranches outright. He cannot own what he does not hold paper on." "No," Clarence said, "but he can make sure both of you default on those loans inside the same season, buy the water rights out of foreclosure for pennies, and never once have to explain to a soul why 2 feuding ranches both happened to go under in the very year his mill needed the water most." Lavinia sat down slowly at her table, the pieces arranging themselves in her mind with the terrible clarity of something she should have seen long before now. The cut fences, the strayed cattle, Whoever is doing this is not trying to hurt Hargrove or hurt me specifically. They are trying to keep us fighting each other so neither of us has the time or the goodwill to notice what is actually happening to our water rights." "And the stagecoach," Clarence said. "Judge Finch was riding this circuit to hear a land dispute case out of Austin. If four masked men had gotten their hands on whatever papers he was carrying or delayed him long enough to miss the hearing, I would bet good money it would have gone poorly for whichever party Voss did not favor." "We need proof," Lavinia said, "not a mill clerk's gossip, something we can put in front of Judge Finch and Sheriff Callahan both." "The ledger," Clarence said, "the one the clerks were fretting over. If it is missing from the office, somebody took it, and I would wager my saddle it did not walk off on its own." They did not have long to wonder who. 2 days later, Ezra Hargrove himself arrived at Lavinia's gate, not with a rifle this time but with his hat in his hands and an expression of a man eating something bitter, and told her that one of his own hired men, a fellow named Dutch Riller who had only come on that spring, had disappeared in the night along with 2 months' unpaid wages and a horse that did not belong to him. "I found this in his bunk," Ezra said, holding out a small ledger, water-stained but legible. "And I do not rightly know what to make of half these figures, but your name is in here more than mine, and I thought, given everything, you had better see it before I did anything foolish with it." It was, Lavinia thought, turning the pages with Clarence reading over her shoulder, the closest thing to an apology Ezra Hargrove had ever offered anyone, and she accepted it in the same spirit it was given. The ledger, once they had puzzled through Voss's cramped handwriting, laid it out plainly enough for even a circuit judge unfamiliar with ranch bookkeeping to understand. Payments to a man named Riller for services rendered, dated to match, almost exactly, every act of sabotage on both the Turner and Hargrove range that summer. A running tally of interest accrued on both loans, with a column marked in Voss's own hand water rights value upon default, and a figure beside it that made Lavinia's stomach turn. "This is enough to hang him," Ezra said grimly. "It is enough to ruin him," Clarence corrected, "which in this district amounts to about the same thing. But we need Riller himself or someone who can swear to what he was paid to do, or Voss will simply say the ledger is a forgery and that he never wrote a word of it." "Riller has run," Lavinia said. "Where would a man like that go with 2 months' wages and a stolen horse?" "Up into the high country," Ezra said slowly. "There is an old mining claim above Antelope Creek, abandoned these 5 years, where drifters sometimes hole up. I have found sign of a camp there before and never thought much of it." It was Clarence who volunteered to go after him, and it was Lavinia who argued longest against him going alone. "The rain has not let up in 3 days," she said. "That country floods without warning. You know that as well as I do, and if Riller is desperate enough to run, he may be desperate enough to shoot at whoever comes looking." "That is exactly why I ought to go alone," Clarence said. "I have driven cattle through worse ground than that in worse weather, and I will move faster without worrying over anybody but myself." "You will move faster," Lavinia said, "and you will also have nobody to signal if something goes wrong. I am coming as far as the low bench at least, with Amos, in case you need a second set of eyes or a second gun." He wanted to argue. She could see the argument sitting right there behind his teeth. But something in her face must have told him it would be a waste of both their time, because instead he only nodded once, short and sharp, and said, "Bring your good rope. That country eats horses that do not know their footing." He left before first light 2 days later, riding a fresh horse borrowed from Ezra Hargrove's own stock as a gesture that meant more, between the two ranchers, than either would have admitted aloud. And Lavinia watched him go from her porch with a knot in her chest she did not examine too closely, because examining it would have meant admitting things she was not yet ready to say, even to herself. The rain, which had teased at slackening for 2 days, came back that afternoon with a vengeance the district had not yet seen that summer, and by nightfall word reached the ranch. carried by a rider sent down from the Rourke outfit's camp, that the high trail above Antelope Creek had washed out in 3 places, and that nobody had seen or heard from Clarence McCrae since the previous evening. Lavinia did not sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table with a lantern burning low and the ledger open in front of her, though she was not reading it, only holding it, the way a person holds onto something solid when the ground underneath them has gone uncertain. At first light she was saddled and riding for Ezra Hargrove's gate before Amos had even finished his coffee. "You cannot go up there alone," Amos said, following her out. "That country will kill you in this weather same as it would kill anybody." "I am not going alone," Lavinia said. "I am going to gather every man in this valley who owes Clarence McCrae a debt of decency, and there had better be a great many of them because I intend to collect." She was not wrong about that. Ezra Hargrove came without being asked twice, bringing 2 of his own hands and enough rope and blankets for a proper search. Old Tom Rourke rode down from his camp with 3 drovers and a pack mule loaded with provisions the moment word reached him. Even the sheriff, Boone Callahan, once shown the ledger and told plainly what was at stake, agreed to ride along, muttering that a man missing in a flood was a great deal more urgent than a man missing 3 months' wages. They rode up into the high country together, 7 riders and a pack mule, through rain that came in sideways sheets and switched, without warning, to a cold, driving drizzle that soaked through every layer a person owned. The trail Ezra remembered was gone in 2 places, swallowed by fresh rock slides, and they were forced to backtrack twice, losing precious hours, while Lavinia fought down a rising, cold fear that had nothing to do with the weather. It was near dusk on the 2nd day of searching, with the light failing fast and every rider in the party grim and silent with exhaustion, that Ezra Hargrove, riding point, called out and pointed up toward the ridge above them. "Fire," he said. "There on the shoulder of the ridge." And another further along. Lavinia's heart climbed into her throat. 2 fires, small and deliberate, spaced along the high ridge in a pattern too regular to be accidental. "That is a signal," Sheriff Callahan said slowly. "Somebody up there wants to be found and wants us to know exactly which way to come." "Or somebody up there is guiding us in," Lavinia said, and something in her chest, some tight, frightened thing she had been carrying since the rider brought his news, loosened just slightly at the thought, because it meant, whoever had built those fires, they were alive enough to build them. They pushed the horses as hard as the treacherous ground allowed, following the line of the fires up a switchback trail that Clarence, they would later learn, had scouted and marked with cairns of stacked stone at every dangerous turn, precisely so that anyone coming after him would not make the same mistakes he had. They found him at the 3rd fire, on a narrow bench of rock above a drop that made even Ezra Hargrove go quiet, with his left leg splinted crudely with a broken branch and a strip of his own shirt, and a man tied hand and foot beside him who could only be Dutch Riller, cursing steadily under his breath. Clarence looked up as they rode into the firelight, exhausted, filthy, his face gray with pain but his eyes clear and entirely, stubbornly alert. "You are later than I expected," he said, which was so exactly like him that Lavinia both laughed and nearly wept in the same breath. She was off her horse and kneeling beside him before anyone else had dismounted. "What happened to you?" "Rockslide took the trail out from under me and the horse both, day before yesterday. Horse did not make it." "I did mostly, though my leg has an opinion about that decision. I found this fellow's camp not far from here and figured, since I was not going anywhere fast, I might as well make myself useful and keep him from wandering off, and then I built fires every evening on the chance somebody sensible enough to look for signal smoke came looking." "You could have died up here," Lavinia said, her voice not quite steady. "Could have," he agreed. "Did not, though. Was rather counting on you not letting me." She looked at him then, filthy and broken-legged and entirely unbowed, having spent 2 days alone in flood-torn high country, not merely surviving, but capturing the very evidence they needed and guiding his own rescue besides. and something in her chest that had been guarded and careful for 2 long years, since her father's death, simply gave way. "You stubborn, impossible man," she said, and kissed him, right there on the cold, wet rock with 6 other people watching and Dutch Riller cursing in the background. And Clarence McCrae, despite a broken leg and 2 days without proper food, kissed her back like a man who had been waiting a very long while for exactly that. "About time," Ezra Hargrove observed dryly to Tom Rourke, who only grinned and began, with practical good sense, organizing the litter they would need to carry Clarence back down the mountain. The trip down took the better part of a day and a half, careful and slow, with an injured man and a bound prisoner both to manage. But it was, in its way, the easiest part of the whole ordeal, because for the first time in weeks, Lavinia rode with no knot of dread sitting in her chest, only a fierce, protective tenderness she had not let herself feel toward anyone since her father died. Dutch Riller, once safely delivered to Sheriff Callahan's custody in Esperanza, proved a great deal less loyal to Silas Voss than Voss had likely hoped, and within a day of sitting in the town's small jail with the ledger laid out plainly in front of him, he had signed a full confession naming Voss as the man who had paid him to cut Turner fences, drive strayed cattle onto Hargrove land, and arrange the ambush of the Carrizo stage in hopes of delaying Judge Finch's hearing on an unrelated water dispute that would have gone against Voss's interests. Judge Finch, his wrist still healing in a splint, presided personally over the matter, since it touched directly on the very hearing he had been riding to attend when the stage went over, and Silas Voss found himself standing in the same dusty courtroom where he had once smiled so smoothly at ranchers signing away their futures, listening to his own ledger read aloud by a clerk, while half of Esperanza crowded the doorway to watch. "You will forgive me, Mr. Voss," Judge Finch said, once the reading was finished, "if I find it difficult to extend you the benefit of any doubt whatsoever. Fraud against 2 ranching families, conspiracy in an armed assault upon a public conveyance, and an attempt to obstruct the lawful business of this court. I imagine the territory will have a great deal to say to you about all of it, and none of it pleasant." Voss, stripped at last of his smooth, unbothered calm, tried appeals, tried threats, tried in the end, a kind of pleading that fooled no one in the room, and was led out in irons to a wagon that would carry him to await trial in Carson City, his mill placed under a receiver appointed by the court until its ownership could be properly untangled, and the water rights he had schemed so patiently to steal returned, by the judge's own order, to the ranchers who had held them honestly all along. Lavinia stood on the courthouse steps in the thin, watery sunlight that had finally, after all those weeks, broken through the clouds, and watched the wagon carry Silas Voss away down the very road he had once controlled so completely, and felt something in her chest settle that had been unsettled since the day her father died. Ezra Hargrove found her there, hat in hand again, looking considerably more sheepish than a man of his temperament generally allowed himself to look. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For the meadow, and for a good deal else besides. Man convinces himself of a grudge easy enough when somebody's paying good money to feed it." "You owe me nothing, Ezra," Lavinia said, and meant it. "We were both being played for fools by a man cleverer than either of us wanted to admit. I would rather we simply agreed to be neighbors properly from here forward." "I would like that," he said, and offered his hand, and she shook it, and that was the whole of the feud settled in the end, with far less drama than it had taken to create. Clarence, still on crutches with his leg splinted properly now by the town's doctor, watched the exchange from the courthouse steps with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 2 days alone in the rain making exactly this outcome possible. And when the crowd began finally to disperse, drifting off towards supper and gossip, and the ordinary business of a town returning to itself, he found Lavinia's hand finding his without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other first. They walked slowly on account of his leg, out past the edge of town where the road began its long climb south toward the ranch country, and stood a while in the cooling evening air, watching the last of the storm clouds break apart over the mountains they had so nearly died in together. "I have been thinking," Clarence said, "about what comes next." "Have you?" Lavinia said. "And what has all that thinking produced?" "Tom Rourke offered me a permanent position, running his outfit's drives instead of hiring on piecemeal. Steady work. A cabin on his range, even if I wanted one. That sounds like exactly the kind of settled life a man who has spent 14 years drifting ought to want." "It does," he agreed, "and I turned it down." She turned to look at him properly then, surprised despite herself. "Why on earth would you do that?" "Because Tom Rourke's range is 40 miles north of yours," Clarence said, "and I have discovered over this last month that I do not much care to be 40 miles from anything that matters to me. I have spent 14 years going wherever the hardest work was, telling myself it did not matter where I laid my head down at night because there was nobody waiting on the other end of it to notice whether I came home. I do not want that anymore, Lavinia. I want somewhere to come home to. I want it to be your porch." "You have already been leaving things on my porch for a month," she said, though her voice had gone unsteady in a way that undercut the dryness she was aiming for. "I am not certain what more you think you could add to it." "Myself," Clarence said simply. "I am asking to stay this time, not to leave a sack of flour and ride off before I have to have a conversation about it. I am asking plainly to stay on your ranch, work your range, mend your fences, and marry you, if you will have a man who has got nothing to his name but a good horse, a fair reputation for hard work, and considerably more stubbornness than sense." Lavinia looked at him for a long moment, this trail-worn, patient, immovable man who had ridden into her life over an overturned stagecoach, and never once, in all the weeks since, treated her as anything less than fully capable of handling her own life, even as he quietly, stubbornly refused to let her handle the hardest parts of it entirely alone. "I spent this whole summer telling myself I did not need anybody's help," she said. "Telling myself that asking for it would prove every man in this valley right about what a woman alone could not manage. It took me a long while to understand that letting you leave flour on my step was never about proving I could not manage. It was about learning that managing alone was never the point of any of it. I do not want to manage alone anymore, Clarence. I want a partner, not a rescuer, a partner." "I am not looking to rescue you," Clarence said. "I have seen you ride at armed men without blinking. I have seen you run 400 head of cattle with 2 hired hands and a bad knee between them. I am not fool enough to think you need rescuing. I am only asking to stand beside you while you do all the rest of it yourself, same as you have always done, except now there will be 2 of us doing it instead of 1. That," Lavinia said, "is the first entirely sensible thing you have said to me since the day we met." "I have my moments." "You have very few of them," she said, "but I suppose I have decided to keep you regardless." "Is that a yes, then?" "It is a yes," she said, and kissed him again, slower this time, with none of the desperate fear that had colored the first kiss on the mountain, only the quiet, settled certainty of 2 people who had found in each other exactly the kind of belonging that neither one of them had known they were still looking for. They were married that autumn, once the roads had dried and the last of the summer's damage had been repaired, in a small ceremony on the Turner ranch attended by Amos and Dooley, fully recovered now and grinning through the whole affair, by Ezra Hargrove and his own small family, by Tom Rourke and half his outfit, and by Judge Finch himself, who happened to be riding the circuit through Esperanza that week and declared with evident satisfaction that he had rarely officiated a match he felt more confident about. Clarence McCrae hung up his drifting boots for good that autumn, though he kept his skill with the hardest cattle drives and put it, from then on, entirely in service of the ranch that had become, at long last, his home. And Lavinia Turner, who had spent a whole hard July too proud to ask anyone for help, found that she had married a man too stubborn to ever fully stop offering it, and discovered, in the years of steady, hard-won happiness that followed, that this particular kind of stubbornness was very much worth keeping for the rest of her life.